On the morning of 10th of June 1940, Benito Mussolini stood on the balcony of Palazzo Venezia in Rome, looking down at a crowd assembled in the Piazza Venezia. The moment was carefully staged, but the tension was real. Europe was already at war. Poland had fallen. France was collapsing. Britain stood alone. Mussolini waited until the last possible moment before declaring war on Britain and France, not because he doubted Adolf Hitler's victory, but because he feared exposing how unprepared his own country truly was. In his private correspondence, Mussolini admitted that Italy needed at least 3 more years before it could fight a modern war. Yet he chose to enter anyway, believing that a short conflict would allow Italy to seize territory without paying the full price of sustained combat. That decision would place millions of Italian soldiers into a conflict their state, economy, and military institutions were fundamentally incapable of sustaining. Italy entered the war with the appearance of a major power but without the structural foundations of one. On paper, the Regio Esercito numbered more than 1.5 million men in 1940. In reality, those forces were spread thin across Italy, North Africa, East Africa, the Balkans, and colonial garrisons. Italy lacked coal, oil, and high-grade iron ore. By 1940, domestic oil production covered less than 10% of military needs. Mechanization was limited. Only a fraction of Italian divisions were motorized, and most artillery relied on horse traction. Italian tanks, such as the L3 Tanquette and early M-series mediums, were lightly armored and undergunned compared to British and later American designs. These were not temporary shortages. They reflected decades of underinvestment, political interference, and an economy that had never fully industrialized at the scale required for 20th century warfare. At the human level, Italian soldiers were not uniquely deficient in courage or endurance. What undermined them was doctrine and leadership. Italian military planning remained rooted in First World War assumptions emphasizing mass infantry assaults and static positions. Combined arms integration was minimal. Air-ground coordination was poor. The Regia Aeronautica operated independently of Army needs, and the Regia Marina focused on fleet engagements rather than sustained logistical support. Mussolini's insistence on personal control further weakened strategic coherence. He routinely bypassed professional military advice, issuing orders directly and replacing commanders frequently, which created uncertainty and encouraged risk-averse behavior among senior officers. The consequences of these systemic weaknesses became visible almost immediately. In September 1940, Italian forces in Libya, under Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, invaded British-held Egypt. Graziani advanced roughly 100 kilometers before halting at Sidi Barrani. He did not stop because of enemy resistance, but because his supply lines were already overstretched. Italian divisions lacked sufficient transport to carry fuel, ammunition, and water across the desert. Rather than push forward, Graziani ordered his troops to dig in. This pause allowed the British Western Desert Force under General Richard O'Connor to prepare a counteroffensive. In December 1940, Operation Compass began with fewer than 40,000 British and Commonwealth troops attacking an Italian force more than 4 times their size. Within 10 weeks, the British captured over 130,000 Italian prisoners, destroyed or captured hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, and advanced deep into Libya. The collapse was not the result of cowardice, but of brittle command structures and logistical failure. Italian units often fought until isolated, then surrendered when ammunition or water ran out. A similar pattern unfolded in East Africa. Italian East Africa, comprising Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland, was geographically isolated and cut off from resupply once war began. The Italian commander, Prince Amadeo, Duke of Aosta, understood the strategic reality. He attempted to defend key positions and conserve resources, but attrition was unavoidable. British, Indian, South African, and African colonial forces applied pressure from multiple directions. By May 1941, Italian resistance collapsed. At Amba Alaghi, The Duke of Aosta surrendered with approximately 7,000 remaining troops after their water supply was destroyed by artillery fire. The defeat eliminated Italy's East African Empire and demonstrated that Italian forces, once isolated from external support, could not sustain prolonged resistance against coordinated Allied operations. Italy's failures were not confined to colonial theaters. In October 1940, Mussolini launched an invasion of Greece from occupied Albania. The decision was made without consulting Germany and against the advice of Italy's own military planners. Italian forces advanced into mountainous terrain during the onset of winter. Lacking cold weather equipment, adequate maps, or reliable intelligence, Greek forces counterattacked and pushed the Italians back into Albania. By December, Italy had suffered over 100,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and frostbitten. The failure forced Hitler to intervene in the Balkans in April 1941, diverting German resources and delaying the invasion of the Soviet Union. Italy's defeat in Greece exposed the gap between fascist ambition and operational reality, while further eroding Allied perceptions of Italian military credibility. As the war progressed, Italian dependence on Germany deepened. German intervention stabilized the North African front after the arrival of General Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps in early 1941. Yet this partnership also highlighted Italy's subordinate role. German units received priority for fuel and equipment. Strategic decisions increasingly reflected German needs rather than Italian interests. The Axis war effort in the Mediterranean became asymmetrical, with Italy providing manpower and territory, while Germany supplied operational effectiveness. This imbalance bred resentment within Italian command structures and further undermined morale. By 1942, the material gap between Italy and the Allies had become insurmountable. The United States entered the war in December 1941, bringing with it industrial capacity on a scale Italy could not match. American shipyards produced more merchant vessels in a single year than Italy possessed in total. Allied air power expanded rapidly. Italian cities, ports, and rail networks came under sustained bombardment. The Italian economy, already strained, began to fracture. Food shortages worsened. Industrial output declined. Civilian morale deteriorated under the combined pressure of bombing, rationing, and military defeat. The decisive blow came in 1943, after Axis defeat at El Alamein in November 1942 and the subsequent loss of North Africa by May 1943, Italy itself became the next target. On 10 July 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily during Operation Husky. The invasion involved more than 160,000 troops on the first day, supported by overwhelming naval and air superiority. Italian coastal defenses were thin and poorly coordinated. Many units disintegrated under bombardment or surrendered with minimal resistance. German formations fought more effectively, but they were too few to compensate for Italian collapse. Within weeks, Sicily fell. The military defeat triggered political collapse. On 25 July 1943, the Fascist Grand Council voted to remove Mussolini from power. King Victor Emmanuel III ordered his arrest. The new Italian government, under Marshal Pietro Badoglio, secretly negotiated an armistice with the Allies. When the armistice was announced on 8 September 1943, the Italian armed forces were given no clear instructions. German forces swiftly disarmed Italian units across the peninsula and occupied much of the country. Hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers were taken prisoner and deported to Germany as military internees. Others joined the Allies or partisan resistance. The Italian state, which Mussolini had claimed would endure for 1,000 years, disintegrated in weeks. The overwhelming of Mussolini's forces by the Allies was not the result of a single battle or a single failure. It was the cumulative outcome of structural weakness, strategic miscalculation, and political hubris. Italy entered the war without the industrial base to sustain modern combat, without a unified command culture, and without realistic objectives. Mussolini's personal leadership style centralized authority while dispersing responsibility, preventing adaptation and honest assessment. Allied forces, by contrast, learned from early failures, coordinated multinational resources, and exploited Italy's systemic vulnerabilities with increasing effectiveness. In the end, the war exposed a fundamental truth about authoritarian systems at war. They can mobilize spectacle and loyalty, but they struggle with feedback, flexibility, and institutional honesty. Italian soldiers fought and died across 3 continents, often with discipline and resilience. What they lacked was not bravery, but a state capable of matching ambition with capacity. When the Allies overwhelmed Mussolini's forces, they did so not only with tanks and aircraft, but with logistics, planning, and industrial power. The collapse of Fascist Italy stands as a reminder that modern war punishes illusion relentlessly, and that no regime can substitute rhetoric for readiness indefinitely.